The Hesston Steam Museum is a relatively large railroad museum located in Hesston, Indiana. They're quite famous for a few things, including having very fun events such as a ghost train and Santa train, as well as the only railroad museum I know of to operate 3 different gauges of locomotives: narrow gauge, miniature gauge, and hobby gauge. However, their biggest event is Labor Day weekend of what they call the Steam and Power Show, where double the amount of trains are running, there's tractors galore for people to see, and generally the whole museum is in full swing. I've always gone to this event and always had a blast, but this year was the first time going with my camcorder, and it was also the first time I filmed any steam engines on it. And holy moly, looking forward, I'm just saying these things look a lot better in 60 frames per second. But anyway, this is the story of that Steam and Power Show, and all of the crazy and weird and quite honestly nonsensical things that happened during it. With this being the busiest day on Hesston's entire schedule, it was so busy that the action started before we even got into the museum. See, the miniature gauge train goes so far out of Hesston's that it actually has to pass over the inlet road into the parking lot. And as we were coming in, well, Set Inquiry Central 1 showed up, and I had to jump out of the car to film it. Fittingly, the X-Set Inquiry Central caboose was tagging along behind the X-Set Inquiry Central engine. Once we got actually into the museum, I was completely flabbergasted by the sight of a narrow gauge speeder. I didn't even know speeders existed in narrow gauge, let alone that Hesston's had one. It sat there for like 5 seconds before it suddenly started moving, so that's why the clip is a little bit delayed. And right next to it on display for the day was this 040 tank engine, which, as you can tell by the flags on the smoke box, came from Czechoslovakia. How it ended up here at Hesston's? Absolutely no clue. Looking down towards the station, I was very happy to see number 2 was the engine pulling the big train, just as Set Inquiry Central 1 finished its lap and pulled into the station. I got a photo shoot of them together. Little did I know, both number 2 and the Shay were running on the big train. I had never seen 2 narrow gauge trains running at the same time at Hesston's, so I was quite shocked by this. Number 2 is far superior to the Shay for reasons I will explain later, so I was glad to see it running instead of just the Shay like last year. And right after I took that photo, the hobby gauge Wabash Heritage unit roared into life and passed me. And after a little bit more waiting, number 2 made its grand departure from the station, spitting out an absolutely ludicrous amount of steam as it did so. Seriously, it looks like there's a fire going on at Hesston's with how much steam is in the air just from this one engine. It's crazy. And shortly after, we heard the puffing and bell of the Shay coming around the curve. Got to hear its awesome whistle, too. However, I couldn't finish filming the Shay stopping because, well, number one decided to leave. And then the Kittyland Limited pulled in right behind number one. The miniature trains were right behind each other on this day and often had to wait for each other to leave before pulling into the station. So action on the miniature gauge was pretty much constant. I chatted with some other rail fans for a while and got caught off guard by the Kittyland Limited departing about 5 minutes later. Kittyland train was carrying Set Inquiry Central's only coach along as its last car. And speaking of Set Inquiry Central, number one pulled in right after the Kittyland Limited departed. As I said, miniature gauge action was pretty much constant on this day. Finally, the Shay decided to leave the station. I'm not the biggest fan of this engine because honestly I think side rods are the coolest part of steam locomotives, and obviously this one doesn't have it. And also it's really slow and was holding up number two a lot on this day. But I'm still going to film it. Why wouldn't I? And funnily enough, the speeder was following right behind the Shay. With the Shay gone, I knew it wouldn't be very long before number two rounded this beautifully picturesque curve and pulled into the station. So I rushed over there to get this shot. There's actually a lake off to the left of the frame here, and I was hoping to get a shot of number two with the lake in it, but as you can see, it's completely covered by weeds. So I'm still not perfectly happy with this shot, but it's pretty good for what it is. After number two pulled into the station, we took the opportunity to get on the train, as I really wanted to ride behind number two, and I was pretty sure the opportunities would be limited with two narrow gauge trains running. And of course, as soon as we got on, 8102 decided to leave the station. But after that, it wasn't too long before the sound of number 2's whistle was heard, and I started slowly hauling our excursion train out of the station. However, 1070 had actually departed at the same time as us, and we ended up pacing it for the solid first bit of the journey. Oh, and we also passed the shade too. And 8102 just for good measure. As we started climbing the hill, number 2 started spitting out an unreasonable amount of cinders and sparks from its funnel. If you look closely, you can see that they didn't put the spark arrestor on. I don't know why they didn't do that. But it shocked us quite a lot, and we got absolutely covered in cinders as we were going up the hill. Once we started to reach the less severe gradients, number 2 calmed down a bit as it headed through the Michigan line cutting. Number 2 here is quite an interesting engine being built in 1911 for the United Fruit Company and was exported by H.K. Porter to Guatemala for service in an industrial fruit processing plant. Loco worked there for pretty much its entire service life, switching cars of fruit around and taking short trains. Eventually, though, it was bought by the Black Hills Central Railroad back in the U.S. and was shipped all the way back. However, the engine was in poor mechanical state by that point and was never really run. Eventually, it arrived at Hesston's and didn't run for a very long time there until around 2011 when they decided to give it an overhaul, which was finished in 2019 just in time for my first returns to Hesston's after I got back into trains. The engine currently is at Hesston's and is the main narrow gauge engine, at least it seems, at least when it's operable. It had a short 1-year overhaul recently, just a middle ground overhaul until it needs its next major one. So the engine was out of service for the last Steam and Power show, but it's nice to have it back now. You can also see that there's kind of a tribute to its history with the Guatemala flags that have been fitted to the front. They always fit flags during the Steam and Power shows, and I think it's very nice. It sets it apart from just a regular working day.
1950s, they set up a trading post general store, 1100 the road.
Number 2 then had to battle the steepest part of the line. In fact, it's actually the steepest grade in all of Indiana. And you can actually see, thanks to the shadows from the trees, all the cinders flying out of its smokestack during this part. The train then stopped as it had to wait for the shade to get to the station. And while it was stopped, we got a great view of the alligators that are sitting on the side of the tracks on display. And also 8102 showed up, also waiting for the shade to clear before it could get moving. Eventually, as number 2 started up, the Shay also rolled by as it had finally cleared the line. Then we rolled past the hobby gauge locomotive shops with 3 steam engines and a caboose there. There was an Atlantic, a Heissler, a CB&Q caboose, and a random 040. And after a round knee curve, which I sadly didn't film, we rolled into the station and our train trip was over. Very awesome. I love the big train rides at Hesston, especially with the grades they have to climb up. The Shay, another reason why I don't like the Shay is because since it's a geared engine, it can climb up the grades no problem, while number 2 always puts on a show going up the grades, as demonstrated here. Film.
You go skedaddle, you go skedaddle. We go with Dozier filming activities.
Straight from number 2's train, I rushed over to the miniature gauge siding to get this shot of Set Inquiry 1 passing it. Over at the miniature gauge station, we see this Seaboard Airline GP9, which is always here but never seems to move, before the Wabash Heritage Unit pulled in. And after it did that, 8102 pulled out, like literally immediately after. Heading back over to the miniature gauge station, number 1 throttled up and left. Now I headed over to this little open cutting right next to the miniature gauge locomotive shops, where you can get a great view of all 3 lines. However, when I arrived, the Shay was sitting there waiting for number 2 to get to the station. And after not too long, it departed. I had to cut the Shay departure shot short because I could literally hear number 2 pulling out of the station, and I was prioritizing the shot of that, of course. I'm a really big fan of this shot, as it's the first time I filmed number 2 moving along the line, rather than starting or stopping. It really does give a very nice vibe, especially with the forest. And after it passed, 8102 appeared from behind the trees, as it had also been waiting for number 2 to leave before it could head back into the station. And turning around to take a look at the miniature gauge locomotive shops, we see 2 engines. First is this 440 named the General. It used to be on display over by the miniature gauge locomotive sidings, but for some reason they've moved it here. Maybe a possible restoration? Also there is the Kittyland Limited's Doppelganger. This engine is a 484 Northern, and it was brought here in 2009, just like the Kittyland Limited 464 that's currently running. However, the thing has fallen into poor mechanical condition, and they only had the budget to keep 2 miniature gauge engines running. And with this engine being a larger Northern, it was just more expensive and didn't really fit in the budget. It's really cool though, and I hope to see it back in service one day, but I highly doubt it. And if it is, it'll take a very long time. Also here is Hesston's coal storage, which I decided to take a picture of because I thought it was interesting. And speaking of the Kittyland Limited, the operational 4641 was just coming up the track, and I got a shot of it as well. I made my way back towards the station and stood on this hill to film a couple departures. I like the slightly overhead shot from here, so I decided to do this. First was 8102, and as you can see, they actually upgraded it to have functioning flashing ditch lights since last time I saw it. Nice little update to keep it more accurate to the real thing. The next departure from the station was another miniature gauge one. Of course, it was set in Query Central number 1, as it was following behind the Kittyland Limited I just saw at the other spot. And the final departure from that high vantage point was, of course, the last gauge I hadn't filmed from there yet, the Shea number 7 on the narrow gauge. Once again, returning back to the main station, number 2 has pulled back in, and so is the Kittyland Limited, with that train now having its time to depart, roaring out of the station. I then headed over to the miniature gauge sidings to see one depart from its stop, but was shocked when I saw number 2 and its whole train reversing. I didn't know this at the time, but the engine was being put away for the day as the event was winding down. One departed just as number 2 rolled around the curve and went past it. After a brief stop, 2 reversed into the siding to let the shade pass before it could head into the locomotive shops. Not wanting to miss filming the rarely filmed event of number 2 getting put back into the shops, I headed over there, accidentally catching the Wabash Heritage Unit departing on the way. Once I made it to the shops, it wasn't too long before the sound of number 2's whistle was heard, and it rolled on the line behind the shops and stopped just behind the points that will allow it to switch into the shops and be put away for the day. After the points were switched, number 2 roared out of the forest once again and headed over the very nice S-curve into the shops. It actually wasn't going all the way into the shops, as they weren't going to put it away until it was fully steamed down, so that way they wouldn't fill the shops with smoke. So it stopped just beyond the shop door. But I did get this nice shot of it going around the S-curve. I'm glad they didn't just stop it just at the points and do the minimum amount of work required. They actually put it by the shops, which is nice. At least for the shot. After that, the event was winding down, and I really wanted to get one more ride behind steam before the day ended, which is why I didn't go on the miniature train, by the way. The engine that just so happened to be at the platform when I arrived was, of course, the Kittyland Limited Hesston. Being the only streamlined engine at Hesston's, it was nice to get a ride on this specific one. The medium train ride is, I think, the most fun, not only because it's powered by steam, but also because you're so low to the ground on the coaches that it really seems like you're flying by on an express from the 1930s, like CB&Q or something, especially with the Set Inquiry Central one. The CB&Q vibe is definitely here, but this is more of a Chicago and Northwestern vibe, as evident by the CNNW logo on the front of the engine. Speaking of the engine, this one has a very interesting history, just like number 2. It was built in the 1930s for the Kittyland Steam Park in Chicagoland, and ran there for pretty much its entire career. That was the whole reason they built it. It's also why they had that other Northern. They had 2 diesel trains too, but we'll get to those. Then in 2009, the park shut down. However, since the engine was compatible with the Hesston's track, they decided to send it there. Both it and the Northern operated for a few years, but eventually the Northern was pretty worn out. So they decided to just keep the Hudson in operation, as it was very similar to Set Inquiry Central 1, which would save on maintenance costs. Not to mention the Northern is an oil burner. The engine has run at Hesston's ever since, and eventually got the name Harold E. Wager Jr. on the cab, and the Challenger number plate on the side. Now we're about halfway through the train ride, and as you can see, we're far outside of the main area of Hesston's. The miniature gauge train makes a very long trek outside and on this little line that wraps around this giant field. I don't know why Hesston doesn't put stuff in this giant field. I'm assuming they just don't have anything to put there, but it does provide a nice long route for the miniature gauge train to go on. As a result, as I mentioned earlier, this train also has to pass over the road that takes you into the parking lot. And eventually, we crossed the crossing from the train, and we got to see the one and only crossing gates on the entirety of Hesston's. And after that, the train ride was over, finishing up with an awesome whistle blast from the Kittyland Limited. After that, there was only one more shot I really wanted, which took me to this area on the far edge of Hesston's, where they had this random dismantled steam crane sitting there. I wanted a shot of the miniature gauge train going through this foresty area. I waited for a very long time, expecting number 1 to show up as it was in front of the Kittyland Limited, only to find out they put it away, and I waited the whole time for the Kittyland Limited to come back so I could get this admittedly nice shot of it going through the forest. However, while I was waiting for the Kittyland Limited for that shot, I was talking to fellow rail fan Western Ohio Interurban History and Video, and he had this random dump truck that he was taking a video of the train passing. He explained that he bought it at one of the vendors at Hesston's and wanted a shot of it going by the miniature train. You can see on screen right now the shot he got of it going by. Unfortunately, as he explained to me, the big train was just too big for it to be in scale, so I suggested we go film the mini train. So we headed over to do that. But before the mini train could depart, the Shay had to. And I really do like the shot because I got a nice view of the Shay's motion, even if I did get a little wet from the steam the Shay blasted at me. And just like earlier, the speeder was following right behind. After that, we made our way over to the miniature gauge crossing, and both me and Western Interurban got shots of 8102 passing his dump truck. And after that, because my brother forced me to, we decided to leave. But unfortunately for him, I had to catch the Kidland Limited one more time because we had to wait for it to cross before we could leave. And with all that said, I hope you enjoyed this video. Catch those units while you can, especially the tiny steam-powered ones, and I will see you in the next video.